In 1981, the Sri Lankan army did something that looked completely insane from a distance. They poured concrete, they stacked sandbags, they built a granite wall several feet thick in a tight ring, and they posted armed guards around it 24 hours a day in rotating shifts for years. They weren't protecting a president, they weren't protecting a weapons depot or an air base. They were protecting a tree. A civil war was about to tear Sri Lanka apart, a conflict that would eventually kill more than 100,000 people over the next 3 decades. And in the middle of that chaos, military intelligence decided that one of their top priorities, on the same list as protecting the capital, was a single tree standing in the city of Anuradhapura.
To understand why, you have to understand what that tree actually is. Because by the time soldiers wrapped it in granite, it had already been alive for over 2,200 years. It had already outlasted the Roman Empire. It had already outlasted the Mongol Empire. It had watched Anuradhapura itself rise as one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, and then watched it get abandoned to jungle for almost 1,000 years, swallowed by vines and silence. And the tree just kept standing there the entire time, growing indifferent. This is a story about 7 trees like that. Trees that should not, by any normal measure, still exist. Trees that have watched dynasties rise and dissolve, watched colonizers arrive and eventually leave in defeat, watched wars break out and end, generation after generation, century after century, while they simply continue doing the one thing they've always done: growing. And the tree in Sri Lanka is where the story has to start, because it isn't just old. It's the oldest tree on Earth with a documented, written-down planting date, something almost no other living organism on the planet can claim.
Its name is Jayasri Mahabodhi. According to ancient Buddhist chronicles, in the year 288 BCE, a sapling was carried by sea from India to Sri Lanka. It was said to be a direct cutting from the original tree under which Siddhartha Gautama sat when he reached enlightenment, the tree that gave Buddhism its foundational image. That sapling was planted in Anuradhapura, and from that exact moment, an unbroken chain of monks began guarding it. Not occasionally, continuously. For over 2,300 years, there has never been a single generation where this tree went unwatched. Invaders came. The Chola dynasty from southern India sacked Anuradhapura more than once. Portuguese colonizers arrived centuries later, burning temples and attempting to erase indigenous religious sites across the island. British administrators ruled after them, reshaping the entire country's economy and political structure. Every single one of those powers believed their presence was permanent. None of them were. The tree outlived the Cholas. It outlived the Portuguese occupation. It outlived British colonial rule on something the entire Sinhalese Buddhist identity had quietly organized itself around for over 2 millennia. So they built a wall of stone around living wood, and they kept it standing through artillery shelling distance, through suicide bombings in the surrounding city, through a war that reshaped the entire island. It's still alive today.
I don't know why, but I feel like if a tree was a thing, this would be ancestors, because look at the roots. They're all connected. Absolutely stunning. Multi-generations. Like this is the tree that I feel like remind me of ancestors.
The tree that technically isn't one tree at all anymore. It started as a single banyan, planted sometime around the year 1250. But banyan trees do something most trees can't. They grow aerial roots that descend from their branches, reach the ground, and root themselves, eventually thickening into what look like entirely separate trunks. Over roughly 8 centuries, this single organism didn't just grow upward, it expanded outward, trunk after trunk after trunk, until it became what's now called the Great Banyan, a structure so vast it covers an area larger than 4 football fields combined. Walking into it doesn't feel like approaching a tree. It feels like walking into a forest, except every single trunk you're standing among is connected to the same root system, the same organism, the same continuous life that began in the 13th century. In 1925, a massive cyclone tore through Kolkata and ripped apart the tree's original central trunk, the very first trunk, the one that started everything in 1250. Botanists expected this might kill the tree, or at least permanently damage it. It didn't.
the tree had already distributed itself so widely across hundreds of secondary trunks that the original core had become almost irrelevant to its survival. It would be an attack on something the entire Sinhalese Buddhist identity had quietly organized itself around for over 2 millennia. So they built a wall of stone around living wood, and they kept it standing through artillery shelling distance, through suicide bombings in the surrounding city, through a war that reshaped the entire island. It's still alive today, still guarded, still growing. But age alone doesn't explain why some of these trees survive, while everything around them turns to ruin. Sometimes it's scale. Sometimes a tree survives not by being protected, but by becoming too large, too distributed, too strange to actually kill.
Eventually, botanists made the decision to remove the dead center entirely, cutting away the literal origin point of the organism. The Great Banyan didn't need it anymore. It had already become something larger and stranger than a single trunk ever could be, a living network that had quietly out-engineered its own mortality. If the banyan survived by spreading itself too wide to kill, the next tree survived through something closer to sheer geological stubbornness. On the remote Japanese island of Yakushima, deep in a cloud forest, reachable only by a long, punishing hike past waterfalls and moss-covered boulders, stands a cedar tree that doesn't just challenge how old something can get, it challenges whether we can even measure it. Locals call it Jomon Sugi, after Japan's prehistoric Jomon period. Scientists have tried for decades to pin down its exact age using core samples and ring counts, the same way they would with any other ancient tree. They can't. The trunk's interior is too decayed, too eroded by thousands of years of moisture for the rings to be reliably counted. The most conservative estimates put Jomon Sugi at around 2,000 years old. The most aggressive estimates push that number past 7,000. If that higher number is even close to correct, this tree was alive before the pyramids of Giza were built, before written language existed anywhere on Earth. What makes Yakushima's isolation so important isn't just the tree's age, it's that the island's extreme rainfall, remoteness, and near total lack of human settlement around the tree created exactly the conditions needed for something to survive 7,000 years without being cut down, burned, or cleared for farmland. Most ancient trees that reach this age survive because humans deliberately protect them. Jomon Sugi may have survived simply because almost no one could reach it. Not every ancient tree in Asia survived through isolation or sheer size or armed guards. Some survived through a much stranger method. Themselves become the very ruins they were supposed to be growing next to. At Ta Prohm, part of the Angkor temple complex in Cambodia, silk cotton trees and strangler figs didn't just grow near the ancient sandstone structures built by the Khmer Empire starting in the 12th century. They grew through them. Their roots crept into cracks in the stonework, expanded over centuries, and eventually wrapped entirely around walls and doorways like fingers slowly closing into a fist. In some places, root systems have physically lifted multi-ton sandstone blocks several feet into the air, suspending ancient architecture inside a cage of living wood. When French explorers rediscovered Angkor in the 19th century, after the Khmer Empire had collapsed and the jungle had reclaimed the site for centuries, they faced an unusual decision. They could remove the trees to restore the temple to its original state, or they could leave them exactly as they'd grown. They chose to leave most of them in place. The result is a site that doesn't read as a restored monument to a fallen empire. It reads as proof that nature was the final, undefeated power in the entire story. The Khmer Empire built an empire that controlled vast stretches of Southeast Asia. The trees simply waited, and eventually took the temple back anyway. Not every entry on this list survives by conquering something. Some survive simply by being too strange, too geographically isolated, for evolution itself to produce anywhere else. 600 miles off the coast of mainland Yemen, in the Arabian Sea, sits an island called Socotra, separated from the rest of the world for roughly 6 million years. That isolation turned the island into something close to an evolutionary laboratory, and one species in particular became its most famous result, the dragon blood tree, with a canopy shaped almost like an umbrella turned inside out, unlike nearly anything else on Earth. When its bark is cut, the tree weeps a thick, dark red resin. Ancient traders who encountered it centuries ago believed they'd discovered literal dragon's blood, and they built an entire economy around it, using the resin as medicine, as dye, and eventually as a varnish ingredient prized by violin makers.
Reportedly including craftsmen working on Stradivarius instruments. Socotra has so many species found nowhere else on the planet that scientists frequently call it the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean. But the same extreme isolation that allowed these trees to evolve into something this unique now makes them extremely vulnerable. Yemen's ongoing civil war has made conservation efforts on Socotra dangerous and inconsistent, and rising sea temperatures threaten the very microclimate that made this evolutionary experiment possible in the first place.
The dragon blood tree survived 6 million years of isolation. It's an open question whether it survives the next 100. In the Philippines, a different kind of strangeness shows up. Not ancient ruins, not isolation, but a tree that looks almost artificially designed. The rainbow eucalyptus, found scattered through forests on Mindanao, sheds patches of its outer bark unevenly throughout the year. As it does, it reveals layer after layer underneath in green, blue, orange, and deep purple, creating a trunk that looks closer to a painting than a living organism. It's not dye. It's not artificial. It's simply how the bark naturally ages and peels.
The problem is that this same tree is heavily valued for its wood pulp, which means some of the most visually extraordinary trees on the planet are also some of the most actively logged. A tree people travel across the world to photograph is, in the same forests, being cut down for paper production. Which brings us, finally, back to Japan, and to a tree that has nothing to do with size or isolation or ruins, but with something quieter and arguably more emotional: repetition.
In the shadow of Mount Fuji, in Yamanashi Prefecture, stands a cherry tree believed to be the oldest of its kind on the entire planet. The Yamataka Jindai Zakura has been alive for roughly 2,000 years. Its trunk today is cracked, partially hollow, and physically held upright by wooden support beams because the tree itself can no longer fully support its own weight.
And every single spring, despite all of that, it still blooms. The same brief, pale explosion of cherry blossoms it has produced for 2,000 consecutive years, long before Japan existed as a unified nation, long before most of the empires mentioned in this video had even formed. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't know there's a mountain named Fuji standing behind it that tourists travel across the planet to see. It simply repeats the one act it's always performed, year after year for 2 millennia, because that's what it has always done.
7 trees, 7 different methods of survival. One guarded by soldiers, one that became a forest pretending to be a single trunk, one too remote to count its own rings, one that conquered a temple by simply outweighting an empire, one that evolved in isolation so extreme it now looks alien, one beautiful enough to be logged into near disappearance, and one that just keeps blooming year after year, whether or not anyone's left alive to remember why.
Every civilization that built monuments near these trees believed at the time that their power was permanent. The Cholas believed it, the Khmer Empire believed it, colonial administrations across half of Asia believed it. They were all wrong. The trees were never trying to outlast them. They were simply growing the same way they always had, completely indifferent to the timeline of human ambition happening around their roots. The empires didn't get a choice in the matter. The trees just never stopped.